Good morning, Chattanooga. This is Legal Bytes. I'm your host, Clay Whitaker, with my co-host, Trevor Atchley. Good morning, Trevor.
Hey, Clay. Good morning.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're here this morning. We're going to talk about some topics, as we always do, that are current, relate to issues that are in the press. One of the things that we have that's a hot topic right now is the issue of gun control. You ready to talk about that, Trevor?
Well, I believe so, yes.
Well, so what we've done the last show, we sort of adopted a new format for all you listeners out there. If you'd like to call in about any topic, so it doesn't matter that today we're talking about gun control, you certainly can call in about that topic. But if you have another topic, we're able to handle those questions. Give us a call. We'll try to do our best with it and get some discussion going on any issues you'd like to talk about. So this morning, we're here talking about gun control. As we said, our number is 800-8949. This is Legal Bytes. We're on Nooga Radio. Give us a call. We'd be pleased to talk with you. We're two lawyers from the firm of McCoon, Williams, Atchley, and Stanley. We have a phone number at 756-6400. We'd be pleased to talk with you about any issues in private if you'd like to call our firm, and there are always attorneys there who are ready to answer your questions. So, Trevor, latest problem that we've had that sort of generated this latest discussion on gun control was the shooting in Las Vegas, October the 1st of this year.
That's right. Now, well, we've had a couple of these where a perpetrator has used a long gun or rifle with a high capacity magazine and inflicted a number of fatalities. It certainly is not, unfortunately, it's not an isolated incident. And when one of these occurs, the debate surrounding what we call quote unquote gun control comes back into the social conscience.
Well, as usual, when we have a national tragedy, our media is soon to jump on that and to promote whatever political gain. As Rahm Emanuel likes to say, never let a good crisis go to waste, right?
Well, I don't think I'm quite as cynical as you are. I don't know that.
Who, me? Cynical?
I would abide necessarily 100% with that, but I do agree with you. The topic is discussed frequently on national media.
Well, so one of the things that I always notice is as soon as the learned persons on our televisions begin talking about this subject, they always indicate we don't have sufficient gun control. So one of the things I thought we'd do today is talk about what gun control we do have. And some of the things that might be a problem with our gun control, we can always talk about that as well. I know we probably want to get into the issue of bump stocks if we can. I also thought it might be interesting to talk about the new problem that we have with technology. Anytime technology pops up, sometimes creates legislative problems that we're slow to act on. One of those issues might be the 3D printer and the ability for people to take a design for a firearm, print it off on a 3D printer, and have a workable firearm that is not registered, that does not comply with the current gun control laws.
Yeah, and I don't know a lot about the capability of using a 3D printer. I could foresee somebody being able to fabricate a weapon. I do wonder, however, how many times it could be used, considering all the friction that would be and heat would be created in discharging a firearm.
Well, I'm sure that there are some evil-minded people out there who would love to. Well, evil-minded might be too strong. They might just be inventive and adventuresome. So they might want to take a gun and print one that's 3D and use it. There's nothing wrong with firearms, so let's get that position out of the way. It's the use of them that seems to be the issue, and consequently, legislation has been developed to control the use of them and the possession of them. So let's talk. The first thing I want to talk about this morning with you, Trevor, is the National Firearms Act in 1934. That act was originally set in motion as a result of the activities of Al Capone and really caused, right. All the gangsters, really caused as a result of prohibition. So if we look at why we had gun control, we had guns all over the United States before this, not a whole lot of control over them, except if using two hands. Had to get that one in there.
Well, let's, if you don't mind, take just a little bit of a step back.
Sure.
I think any discussion regarding firearms always seems to focus and center on the Second Amendment to our United States Constitution, and that prohibition on the power of government.
You're going to take the big view. You're taking the constitutional approach, aren't you?
Well, this is a restriction, at least initially intended only to apply to the federal government, but The text of that amendment is a well-regulated militia being necessary for the security of a free state. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. And so that's the amendment which restricts the power of the government in making specific laws that might infringe upon the right of the people to keep and bear arms.
Well, this is a great point, because the Second Amendment really sort of typifies or focuses the attention of the reader and those in government on the issue of whether or not the Constitution gives you a right or just enshrines a natural right that you have. Certainly, I don't think anyone can argue that we don't have the natural right of self-defense. And of course, the use of technology to do that, whether it's by club, sword, stone, whatever it might be, and in this case, firearm, the use of those things is a natural right. You don't have to ask permission from the government to do it. However, this particular amendment really specifies what, at least in this point in time, what the terms are for that particular usage.
Well, and I think that's the key to understanding these amendments to the United States Constitution. They are not necessarily guaranteeing positive rights. They're restricting the authority of the government to infringe upon what otherwise would be a natural right.
Well, that's right. You know, I think the thing that people always forget is that our Constitution is set to restrict the government. It really is the ball and chain for the government. You always hear the people on television commenting on how, for instance, it always comes up in taxes, how the government's going to give you some tax money back. Well, bottom line is it was your money to begin with. It was taken from you, and it's not really something that the government has a right to, other than the fact that the concerted effort of the people have authorized them to take their portion of it. Right. Yes, right.
The government does have a very broad tax.
Well, there was a pregnant pause there, Trevor, I noticed.
Yeah.
Tennessee also has in our Constitution enshrined the indications in our Constitution of the recognition of our right for citizens to bear and keep arms for their common defense and for their own defense. It says that Article 1, Section 26, the citizens of this state shall have the right to keep and bear arms for the common defense, but the legislature shall have power by law to regulate the wearing of arms and a view to prevent crime. So, you know, our state, talks about how you can actually use these firearms, what you can wear them. And the idea is always to prevent crime. It's worthy of noting we still have a Tennessee militia, and it's for the defense of our state. If that ever was to happen, that we had to defend the state as we've had to do before, that might be something that comes about that, you know, you can use this militia, and it's something everybody might want to join, and you might want to serve your time in the Tennessee militia.
Well, there's a good example of in the Tennessee Constitution. It's a little more explicit in providing what the state may or may not do. And it expressly provides the state with the power to regulate the wearing of arms, which would be, I think, typically considered the carrying of arms.
Well, so if you looked at Tennessee's laws right now, you know, Tennessee's one of those states that has for concealed carry as well as for open carry, which, for a lot of folks, it's always disconcerting to see a citizen walking around, which is a strange thing in my mind. At one point in time, it was very common to see. Now it is unusual to see a citizen walking around with a displayed firearm. Right.
And that can take some getting used to. You typically associate somebody with a firearm carrying it openly, being in law enforcement or, otherwise a franchise of the state. But you're right. Now we do have open carry laws in Tennessee.
Well, so I'm sure you're ready to go out and strap yours on at any moment's notice, Trevor.
Well, yeah, I don't, I worked in before law school, worked in a job where I carried a firearm, and I will tell you that it would not be something I would like to do all the time.
It's heavy, number one.
It's heavy, and you're always worried, or at least I was, that somebody else may try to get it.
And there's a great responsibility with that firearm.
That's absolutely correct.
There's a lot to say about that. That's not the purpose of our show. Any callers want to call in, 800-8949. Clay Whitaker here, your host, co-host Trevor Atchley, and we're here discussing gun control on Nooga Radio. The show is Legal Bytes. Trevor, we were getting ready after we were talking about the overall intent of our framers to allow our citizenry to possess firearms and to use them as part of their right to self-defense and also for the defense of this country. And I think it specifically mentions in our Second Amendment the right to bear arms. And that has been at least construed to mean in some paramilitary or military fashion. Is that right?
Well, I think that's an issue probably that could be debated. But yes, my understanding is when this was originally drafted, to bear arms was a term of art, which referred to carrying arms in a militia for some military purpose.
You know, I also read, and I think this is one of the arguments of many of the divisive groups in our country, that the right to bear arms that's mentioned in our Second Amendment strictly means the right to bear arms, and it was related only to the recovery of runaway slaves. I found that to be far too narrow, considering our history and the way that our country got started, particularly fighting against England.
Right. No, and part of the reason for the Second Amendment was, the states were ultimately relinquishing authority to the federal government. And the framers of our Constitution were very leery of a strong federal government, which, of course, explained the Articles of Confederation, which then eventually that didn't work. So we now have this United States Constitution and more federalist system. And they didn't want, sort of the irony is, part of the purpose of the amendment is they wanted states to maintain their own militia, so there was no need for a national army, which, of course, now it's no longer the case.
Well, and that's probably another show we could get into about the what twos and the why fours, about militias, armies, and so forth. But let's, while we still have a few minutes in this half hour, get back to talking about the gun control we do have. Let's mention the main act is, as we were talking about and very briefly mentioned, that Prohibition set out a crime wave in this country because it allowed people to take advantage of the lack of alcohol. And so there's a number of famous families who are known to have made their fortunes in that regard. And one of the things that happened is that you ended up with a great deal of crime, and particularly use of firearms in doing it. And so we ended up with the National Firearms Act, and that was dated 1934, followed up subsequently by the Federal Firearms Act. Now, those two acts together worked to regulate certain kinds of weapons. If you'll recall seeing plenty of the old movies, like James Cagney movies, for those who still remember seeing black and white films, there were Title II weapons. Title II weapons being and particularly the iconic weapon in that regard was the Tommy gun, 45 caliber with a rotary canister styled attachment that allowed your ammunition to be stored in it and fired from that, and typically from the waist. It always appeared that, we'd fire that Tommy gun from the waist, and that was while you were hanging on the side of your 1938 Chevy Deluxe, shooting up the crowd as you went by.
Well, and this is, you were talking about earlier how the law has to evolve to match with developments in society. And I think this is a reaction to, the advancements in the manufacturing of firearms, which probably had not been anticipated at that point of being perhaps in civilian use. And you had these gangsters who were using these weapons. For example, one of the weapons here, it says is regulated as short-barreled rifles or shotguns. And of course, a short-barreled shotgun has a much larger spread than the regular shotgun and can inflict more damage. So you have those types of provisions there, I think, tailored fairly narrowly to address what they consider to be an issue in public crisis.
Yeah, I think what ended up happening is there was the proliferation of weapons that would ordinarily be used in military application, came on the streets of the United States and were used, of course, by the people who had the money. That was the gangsters who were able to purchase firepower. That included hand grenades and, like you said, what we call by the common parlance, a sawed-off shotgun, a short-barreled rifle, and those things. A machine gun, obviously, is one of them, and other improvised and explosive devices, including things like silencers, that the government realized we had to have some way to regulate, to prevent, of course, the problems that you resulted from that, which was a great deal of carnage on the streets of this country. And so, in any way, that is one of the primary tools that law enforcement has, and then, of course, our country has to regulate these firearms. You can't just own a machine gun, can you?
Oh, no.
Unless
there are ways to own one, but you can't just own one.
You can't go out and purchase one here from your local firearms dealer here in town, your FFL dealer.
And let's specify what we're talking about here, because people may be thinking, well, I see AR-15s all the time. Well, those are semi-automatic. This machine gun we're talking about would be a fully automatic rifle where you, with a semi-automatic, you have to pull the trigger each time you discharge the bullet. Fully automatic weapon, which is what the machine gun is here, would be a weapon where you pull the trigger and it just automatically discharges until you release the trigger.
Gun. So the action of the gun is semi-automatic or automatic. There are other kinds of actions: bolt action, lever action, single action, double action, those kinds of things. But in this particular instance, the danger that the Congress tried to legislate and protect us from was the use of an automatic weapon. And like we mentioned, the idea here, if you keep in your mind the Tommy gun, shooting off and that sort of thing was something the court was, or that the Congress was aiming at. So that's still in effect today. If you want to own some of these, what we call Class 2 weapons, you can own them, but the way that you own them has to be, first you have to make an application to the ATF, Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, and the ATF has a program. You make that application, you pay a fee, and they can set up, or you can set up a trust, or you can purchase that through an LLC, and either way, you have those firearms which are available. Sometimes that's become popularized, or become very popular, it's become very noteworthy. If we were talking prior to this show about the little girl out in Las Vegas who had, I'm not sure if it was an Uzi or some other automatic weapon she was shooting, an unfortunate tragedy, shot the range master with that firearm.
Right. And that was a video on YouTube, which is very disturbing. I would certainly recommend anybody watch it, unless they're just curious to see what happened, but bear in mind, it is very graphic, and that is, probably exemplifies some of the concern regarding fully automatic weapons.
And so with regards to those, I don't think anybody debates that we need to have control over certain types of weapons. One of the things that's become a debated issue now with the Las Vegas tragedy and the massacre that occurred there is the use of the so-called bump stock, which was approved during President Obama's administration. The ATF approved that item, and basically, the way I've heard it described is a sort of loose, almost like a spring that attaches to your stock that allows your finger to remain in the fire position, and it simulates automatic fire, which it seems to me it doesn't really make any difference based upon its function, and why in the world we would allow that to have been approved when we regulate so highly and so heavily machine guns.
That's a good question.
And it was a good question. So we were at 800-8949. We're at Legal Bytes. This is Clay Whitaker and Trevor Atchley. We're talking about the hot topic of gun control. If you'd like to talk about any topic, you want to weigh on this particular one, let us know. We'd be pleased to talk with you about it. Trevor, the next act we want to talk about is the Federal Firearms Act of 1938. It is the one that requires, when you are purchasing a firearm, that the dealer, so in transacting firearms transactions, you have to be a federally licensed dealer. That is, you have to have an importer or a manufacturer of guns. A person in business selling firearms has a federal firearms license.
So this is, just so our viewers aren't, or our listeners aren't confused, this applies to businesses, persons in the business of selling firearms. It wouldn't necessarily apply to a casual sale of a firearm.
That's right. And the other thing that it does is it also regulates who can purchase firearms. So one of the things that was a problem back in the early part of the last century, and was that selling firearms to convicted felons, you couldn't do that. So it regulates who you can sell to. One of them is by whether or not you have been rendered infamous. The second one is whether or not you are a minor. So at the time, it was the age of 18. There's a recognition in our country that there still is a strong hunting tradition. So that young children, they're not young children, but at 18 years old, you could purchase a firearm. It doesn't prevent you from operating one if you're younger than that, but you can't buy one unless you're age 18 and over. That is a long rifle. There is a restriction now from a subsequent piece of legislation that prevents 18-year-olds from purchasing handguns. So you have to be over the age of 18 to purchase a handgun in this country now.
I think that's the next law you have listed here.
Well, we're just moving right along, Trevor. Right. So the next law is the Omnibus Crime and Safe Streets Act of 1968, and it does increase the age of the purchase of handguns because, as you might imagine, the Congress that's dealt with this particular issue recognized that one of the prevalent tools for the commission of crimes, and that is, if you're talking about violent crimes, the use of handguns, resulted from the use of handguns, and young people are sometimes tempted to get involved in that sort of activity. And so by increasing the age that you can purchase it legally, at least, the hope was that you would not, that you would some way impact crime. Now, I don't think that's a realistic point to take now because of the prevalence of handguns. Anybody can purchase one illegally, it appears, and it doesn't really have to do with whether you buy them legally or not. Nobody, of course, who's going to commit a crime or is involved in that activity wants to purchase handguns legally and have them registered to their own names.
Let me ask you a question. Going back up to this Federal Firearms Act of 1938, I noticed here that you were prohibiting the transfer of firearms to certain classes of person. You mentioned those rendered infamous, or what we'd also call convicted felons. What is this also the law where we now have all these convictions for a felony in possession of a firearm?
It is. And, it's also a prohibition for people who've been indicted. So a conviction is not the triggering event that prohibits the sale. If you've been indicted, you can't purchase a firearm either, indicted for a felonious crime. So, just in terms of the limitations, let's don't confuse the fact that the conviction doesn't trigger it.
So how would the merchant know whether or not the prospective purchaser is a criminal charge pending?
Trevor, you've asked the question that's behind the curtain. So I don't know who's pulling the levers, or if there's a gray-haired man back there when you fill out that answers that question. But generally, I would say that it's the National Crime Information Center. And if you've ever been convicted of a crime or been arrested, in that particular instance, the National Crime Information Center has information about that arrest. Now, we have the idea, not to get too far off topic, that you can have those crimes expunged. Yes, we can have them locally expunged. That doesn't necessarily keep the information off the NCIC, as it is called. Law enforcement, particularly the federal government, has the ability to pull that information up, even if you're a juvenile. And they also, I think that now we're going to have to work on legislation for this. I keep calling for this on this show. Hopefully somebody will pick it up. That is, we need to have a way to prevent third parties from buying this information, storing it, keeping it, and using it against our citizenry. So what they do, LexisNexis being one of them, purchases the information from the sale. Purchase the information from the arrest and convictions of individuals from our governmental entities. There's no restraint on them using that information, maintaining it, and that's certainly not something that is required for them to delete from their records. And so many times people have background checks done, and these companies have more information than is readily available through our governmental entities. So not to get too far off topic, but that is something that we need to work with.
Well, that's actually a topic Mr. McCoon and I discussed a couple of weeks ago about it's a federal statute designed to protect citizens' information, and sort of the precipice for that was different states' Department of Motor Vehicles was selling citizens' information to third parties, and they were going to use it for advertising, etc. And the court found that, well, not the court, but the Congress didn't feel that was appropriate, and they instituted an act to prohibit it.
That's not surprising. Make a buck where you can. This is Clay Whitaker, Trevor Atchley, your host today. And we're here at Legal Bytes. This is a Nooga Radio. The number is 800-8949. We're talking about gun control, but we can talk about any topic. We're almost at the end of this half-hour section, and we're going to continue this discussion after the break, Trevor. I want to get into some of the other more recent pieces of legislation, including the assault rifle ban and the Brady bill that everybody will remember the tragedy when President Reagan was attacked and shot by the mentally ill John Hinckley. So if you want to join back up with us after the break, we'd be pleased to talk with you some more. 800-8949. Give us a call. We'll talk about your topics.
The Tennessee Valley's news talk leader, Nooga Radio, digital FM 95.3 HD4 and 92.7 FM. 3, 2, 1. Chattanooga Radio, digital FM 95.3 HD4, 92.7 FM's news now.
2 juveniles have been arrested, but 2 more are on the run after a joyride with a stolen car that started on Neville Road in Ottawa. The Hamilton County Sheriff's Office giving chase. The car wrecked into a junction box for a telephone line on Mountain View Road. 2 juveniles ran off, and 2 others were arrested on scene. The Hamilton County Sheriff's Office and the Chattanooga Police Department trying to track down these 2 young people who escaped. The trial of Skylar Allen is set to begin soon in the Lookout Valley triple murder case, but his attorney is wanting a change of venue because of the high-profile nature of the case. There aren't many people around who would serve as jurors who haven't heard of the case already. A co-defendant, Derek Morris, has already been convicted on those counts of murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. Matthew Cowan, a survivor of the shooting, testified against Morse. Russell Stroud, Nooga Radio News, now.
Traffic, news, and information. Nooga Radio, digital FM 95.3 HD4 and 92.7 FM.
Your marriage is over. You've been abandoned, betrayed. You're angry, shattered, and heartbroken. Don't go it alone. When you are facing divorce, you need an experienced advocate to help protect your rights and future. And you need it from a man with a sympathetic heart, but a hard nose. Attorney Clay Whitaker will fight for you in this most confusing and bitter time in your life. Clay Whitaker, 756-6400.
Nooga Radio, digital FM 95.3 HD4 and 92.7 FM knows your opinion is important. So call 800-8949. Agree or disagree? Call 423-800-8949. 800-8949. Nooga Radio, 92.7 FM and 95.3 HD4. News Talk Nooga Radio.
92.7 FM's fast forecast. Now, 61 degrees for the high, partly cloudy, 40 for the low, clear overnight and clear tomorrow. Temperatures getting down into the 40s overnight. 57 are high tomorrow and 40 for the low. Noticeably cooler tomorrow compared to yesterday and today. Catch Sean Hannity on your drive home from work. He's on every weekday from 3 to 6 on Nooga Radio News Talk 92.7 and 95.3 HD4. That's your fast forecast now.
The Tennessee Valley's news talk leader, Nooga Radio, digital FM 95.3 HD4 and 92.7 FM.
Well, Chattanooga, this is Nooga Radio, Legal Bytes, the sizzling legal topics show that we have every week on Wednesday between 11 and 12. I'm Clay Whitaker. This is Legal Bytes, as I've said. I'm here with co-host Trevor Atchley. We're talking about gun control today. So if you missed the first half, we started discussing the Second Amendment, Tennessee's Article 1, Section 26, that describes both of those constitutional writs actually describe our natural rights and the preservation of restriction of the government's right to anyway restrict our right to own guns and to protect ourselves. And then we talked a little bit about the two primary pieces of legislation that dealt with crime in the 1930s, which was the National Firearms Act, and then the Federal Firearms Act of 1938, which required the purchase of guns from federal firearms licensed dealers. So it controlled the access to guns. So we're here, 800-8949. You want to call in and talk about gun control. If that gets you excited, we'd be pleased to deal with any of your discussion on that issue. Or if you want to talk about any other legal issue, we'd be pleased to talk about that with you. We're going to continue our discussion here. Trevor, we were discussing briefly the Omnibus Crime and Controlled Safe Streets Act of 1968 and the subsequent act, the Gun Control Act of 1968, which both of them had regulating effects on our guns, and the ability to purchase guns was restricted by age in the first one, which prevented minors under the age of 21 from being able to purchase handguns. And that was an idea, at least, to prevent crime. Pretty good idea, I think.
Well, you know, it restricts the purchase, not necessarily possession. So that's an interesting distinction.
Well, and so when you're talking gun control, you know, that is one of the problems. We can control access. We can't necessarily control possession. That's always an after the fact situation. You know, generally if someone under the age or is a prohibited person from possessing the crime, the interdiction by law enforcement can prosecute them for the offense. And there typically are in each state, and certainly with the federal government, prosecutable offenses from prohibited persons having or purchasing firearms, but it doesn't prevent them from possessing them, using them in other crimes. So I think that's one of the things that anytime we're talking about gun control, you've got to be realistic about what we can and cannot do. So one of the things about the Gun Control Act of 1968, it primarily focused on regulating interstate commerce in firearms. We've had previous shows where we've talked about the effect of interstate commerce through the Commerce Clause that our Constitution has. I think you and I've talked about that before.
Oh, absolutely. Yes. And that's where the federal government gets most of its authority.
So the policing power that the government has in regards to the regulation of firearms is through the doctrine involved in the Commerce Clause. And Commerce Clause says that between the states, the government has the right to regulate commerce between the several states. And so in this particular instance, one of the things that you'll find in each of the firearms offenses, if you're prosecuted in federal court, one of the elements of the offense is the court must prove that the particular firearm, the prohibited weapon, traveled in interstate commerce. And you'll find that also with regards to certain violent crimes committed with firearms, that certain of the economic impact that was held, particularly if it was a robbery, you'd have to demonstrate as an element of the offense that the particular crime impacted interstate commerce. That's typically done through demonstrating that there's some sort of commerce between the states. And so that's where we are with this act. The act says that the Congress has the right to regulate what transfers between states. So, for instance, if you have a gun created and made in the state, that might not be subject to regulation, not be subject to at least to this act. There may be other acts.
And this could have, I've not read this particular legislation. The underlying precipice for it could be based on a number of factors. You know, different states, you mentioned the policing power. The federal government doesn't have a quote unquote police power. It only has the powers enumerated to it in the Constitution. State governments, however, do have a quote unquote general police power. And so states generally have much more freedom in passing legislation that restricts citizens from doing certain things. So different states have varying degrees of different laws affecting gun possession, gun ownership, gun transfer. And so part of this act may have actually been to provide some uniformity in laws and how we're going to transfer weapons across state lines.
You know, Trevor, I think our show needs some sound effects. I mean, I'd like to see some, like a Yosemite Sam shooting off his firearm after we make a certain comment or a certain point that's made, because I think it would give emphasis so the listeners, our many listeners out there, would understand what we're talking about, how gravely serious these firearms acts are, and that we do have very effective and efficient gun control in this country. So we're talking also about the more modern pieces of legislation. You know, some of these things were driven by historical events. We mentioned earlier, you know, that certain things are the way that events create legislation. One of those things that was a very big piece of legislation that was created was as a result of the attempted assassination of President Reagan. You know, so we ended up, that was a number of years that was debated, but eventually was a gun control, and it's called the Brady Handgun Violence Prevention Act. And it requires background checks. So, you know, you hear a lot of times on the news about, for instance, this particular case with Stephen Paddock, the shooter in the Las Vegas massacre, you know, that this person passed a background check. So when they say that, you know, there are a number of things that are in the background check, but they primarily relate to your criminal status and your status as an American citizen. You know, aliens can't purchase firearms in our country, at least not legally. It also relates to your mental status. So if there's been any indications that you have mental defect or illness, you're not allowed to purchase. So, you know, those things were carefully crafted, a pretty good piece of legislation. We obviously don't want those classes of persons to be able to purchase handguns or any firearms for that matter.
That's right. And I guess the underlying rationale for that is, particularly with convicted felons, is you think they probably have a propensity for violence.
Well, and they do. And I think if you look at studies, you'll find that many of the violent criminals have impulse control, or maybe they have a sociopathy or a psychopathy, you know, one of those kinds of things. And you can probably find that, and you'll find that is very common among criminals that are incarcerated. So whether it's diagnosed or undiagnosed may be the issue. Sometimes even if you have a situation where someone purchases a gun, but like we said, most of the time criminals are not going down to your Academy Sports or Walmart or wherever it might be and purchasing a firearm for the use in their crime.
Well, that's an issue we see here in Chattanooga almost on the news every day, where we have all these shootings and the police are identifying them as sort of almost a hit between different gang members. You know, they're a targeted hit, I think is the phrase they use.
Well, you know, I saw yesterday where we'd reached the 108 persons who've been shot. It doesn't mean they've all been killed, but they've certainly been shot here in the Chattanooga area this year. So that's a an unfortunate statistic that speaks to apparently the number of persons who think that's an appropriate way to deal with situations in our society. So,
right, that's
sociopathy,
perhaps
psychopathy.
They could benefit from some sort of alternative dispute resolution process,
or maybe a big dose of Thorazine. You never know. So anyway, we're back to the Undetectable Firearms Act of 1988. Effectively criminalizes, with a few exceptions, the manufacture, importation, sale, shipment, and delivery, possession, and transfer of firearms with less than 3.7 ounces of metal content. I really don't know how our legislative body received that particular qualification, that specific specification of 3.7 ounces of metal content. I'm sure there was some expert that said you've got to have that much to operate the firearm, but we brought up the issue before.
Or maybe that was the amount required to trigger a metal detector.
Perhaps magnetometer,
right,
or whatever it might be. So
I'm sure there was some rationale for it.
Well, whatever it is, we were talking before about the new development, the 3D printing, which basically can print using polymers.
Well, and we've had that. Well, we already have some firearms with polymer components. A Glock, for example, has a lot of polymer components. Of course, the barrel is still steel. And so this probably wasn't, as weapon manufacturing has improved and we're using composite materials as opposed to metal content, they saw the need to develop this law for what they considered to be a public safety purpose.
I would predict that at some point, once we have some incident that involves a completely 100% or 90-something% polymer firearm, that you're going to need an additional piece of legislation or qualification with this particular statute and be repealed and revised that deals with 3D printing firearms.
Right. No, I don't disagree with you at all on that. I think it'll be interesting. I think it'll be very difficult for somebody to develop a weapon with that type of composite material that's very durable. But I don't think people, I do think people are going to experiment and try. I imagine we're going to see lots of people hurting their hands, losing digits, going out and testing these things and having the weapon blow up in their hand.
Maybe we need to put that on our new gun control act. If you're missing too many digits, you might need some extra scrutiny.
Well, that's, I guess it all depends on how you lost them. But yeah.
So, well, either way, in regards to 3D printing, it's one of those things. It's a curious thing because it is the kind of thing that regulates ideas. You've got a person that uses the noughts and the aughts and puts, the ones and zeros together and makes a design for a destructive device or firearm or one of those things that would qualify under our gun control arms acts. And consequently, it's the idea that you would actually have to work on, because you wouldn't want people to transfer or be able to transfer the design of a firearm without having some regulation on it.
Well, yeah, right. I mean, I think the technology, though, for digital printing is very sophisticated. It's not easy to come by.
You're probably
I think
right.
it's expensive.
It's probably my unsophistication that imagines that it's more prevalent than it really is. But I did see, where they were developing like a part of a vehicle and some other stuff.
Right.
And I think people have actually already done this and already have made firearms. But you're right about the issue of durability. But if it's a one-shot deal, maybe that's all, somebody needs. So.
Well, I was talking to you before the show. Of course, this is a movie. It was talking about the Clint Eastwood movie, The Atlanta Fire, and John Malkovich's character manufacturing a weapon, building a weapon out of wood. And he was using that so we could get into a black tie affair on a presidential re-election campaign, get access to the president so he could try to assassinate him. And that was the way he intended to sneak in the firearm, was using a wooden weapon. And then he had the bullets and the cartridge, the cartridges and casings and all that inside of a rabbit's foot, so it would pass through the metal detector with his keys.
Very tricky.
Yeah. So, I mean, people have thought about this before. It's very interesting, isn't it?
Well, I'm sure there is. Apparently, that's, I guess there's a whole segment of our society, if you believe the James Bond and those kinds of movies that talk about the development of spy or covert technology. There's a whole segment that's all they do is plan that sort of thing. So
I would think that in clandestine operations, these types of manufactured weapons are probably pretty common.
They might be.
Exactly what you're talking about.
Well, but that's above our pay grade, Trevor. So let's get back on the topic and talk about the issue of gun-free school zones. And so, one thing to remember is that what we're talking about primarily here are federal gun control legislation. Applies to every state. That doesn't necessarily deal with your day-to-day life here in Chattanooga, Tennessee. So, yes, we don't want to have guns in our schools. Although it's interesting, the debate after Virginia Tech was, hey, let's authorize firearms to be in school. So what are they talking about in this particular act?
On college campuses, right?
Yeah, on college campuses.
And this is a
primarily raised to primary and secondary schools.
I would think so, right? And of course, then you have I even don't want to mention it because it's such an awful thing, the Sandy Hook massacre, where again, a mentally ill individual carried off that heinous act. Obviously, this is not going to prevent all those instances.
No, it wouldn't. And of course, if you'll follow around the world, you'll see other instances where people who were intent on doing a great deal of harm to the innocence of a particular society have done so using weapons that are less sophisticated than firearms. So I remember in China, I think he was also mentally ill. Father of a child at a particular school took a knife and went in and tried to do harm to the people at the school. So, what we have not said, what we probably would not necessarily talk about too much on this show, were issues related to the people committing the offenses. That's not legal. That's not legal bites. Those aren't legal topics, and so we probably won't get into that very much. But still, the idea here is that we try to make sure that our children can attend public education without having to worry about firearms being present.
Right. And having some,
unless they're authorized by the governmental entity.
I mean, think about in Chattanooga, for example, where, we're having all these issues with gang violence. Presumably a lot of these offenders are high school age, going to school. Obviously this law is intended to prohibit them from carrying firearms to school. You want school to be a safe place where students can learn and not be worrying about that type of, a possibility of violence occurring.
Yeah, that's, I would agree with you. That's really the idea, is that we need to have, be able to continue our culture, be able to continue the culture that allows us to produce good citizens. I think that's one of the elements you never hear talked about, is the idea of good citizenship in our country. And that includes, in a moderation, at least, patriotism, nationalism, maybe a little, but don't get too carried away with that stuff. We know where that leads to. But anyway, those kinds of things we have to watch out for, and that's what the Gun-Free School Zones Act of 1990 is. Also an element of many crimes in federal court that enhances your punishment. Many times it is a life sentence. Just a warning to you guys talking about selling drugs around schools, using firearms, don't do it. You want to go to jail for the rest of your life. I don't want to support you. The rest of us don't either. Don't do that kind of stuff. So back on topic, Brady Handgun Violence Prevention Act. We mentioned the unfortunate occurrence there with Mr. Hinckley, who I think just got released from federal custody.
Within a couple of years ago. Yeah, I guess he was in a psychiatric hospital for a long time.
He was. Apparently, it's a real instance, not a fake claim of mental incapacity. Apparently, he was very mentally disturbed. I believe some things about President Reagan that, he certainly were not real, but they decided to act on them. And I guess there was some breach in security and allowed that to occur. Still remember very vividly seeing on that street where Mr. Hinckley approached the president and shot Mr. Brady and the president. So he seriously wounded Mr. Brady. I believe he gave him a shot in the head.
I think he paralyzed him.
He did. And, he suffered a very serious injury as a result of that. So,
and that's, obviously when you're, that video you can watch, of when that assassination attempt occurred. And that's probably one of the most, I would think the Secret Service now probably puts people further back from where the president will be walking so that they won't be that close of a range. But at that point in time, there was almost, I don't think even a barricade there. There was some armed men standing in front of the president as security detail, but it wasn't like it is today where, and that's probably the reason citizens are kept further back away from elected officials.
I think you're probably right, Trevor. This is Clay Whitaker and Trevor Atchley. We're your hosts for Legal Bytes, the voice crying in the radio wilderness, decrying the news in the legal world, giving you those topics you need to hear about, those things you want to discuss. This is 800-8949. Give us a call. We're pleased to talk about any legal topics if you'd like to. We're here today discussing the topic of gun control, always a hot topic. And we've talked about the items that, the list, I should say, the list of gun control that we're currently living under, and that I think at least at this point is about as good as you can do. There might be a few things we need to tweak, but it's a pretty substantial list of legislative acts that describe what we can and can't do with our firearms, how we need to handle them. But obviously it never gets back to the individual owner and what the individual owner does, whether that's purchased legally or illegally. So we were talking about that act. You know, that act provides for the background checks we've always heard about on TV. It was enacted in 1993. That act's very important and certainly describes what things that you can or who you can sell to as a federal firearms licensee and who you cannot. So that's an important thing for us to keep our mind on. We're getting close to winding down the hour here, Trevor. So I want to make sure we cover the federal assault weapons ban. You know, that's
which is now, of course, expired.
It has expired. At one point in time, it was basically a restriction on the appearance or the way that a particular firearm appeared. So it describes a number of things, and if you wanted to get in your mind what the iconic image of the assault rifle is, it's the AR-15, M16 variety, the civilian variety of that particular weapon, and the AK-47, I think, is the other sort of iconic. Kalashnikov is the iconic assault rifle that I think we should keep our minds around. So it has expired.
And this talks about, I guess there was at that point in time a ban or restriction on what here is defined as large capacity ammunition feeding devices. Sort of, I guess, the common parlance there would be a high capacity magazine.
Well, and so, you know, there was, I think it was limited, wasn't it limited to 25 rounds in the magazine? I think something like that. I can't remember.
It may have even been more restrictive than that because, you know, a lot of magazines will carry 30 rounds, and that's a military purpose. So it was probably 10 or 15 rounds.
It may have been. And then, of course, those, the magazines actually became quite valuable. I think there's some assault rifles that, you know, difficulty owning them, and that the magazines themselves became something that was sort of prized because of the difficulty in trying to sell a magazine with a shorter capacity in them.
Right. And it also affected handguns also.
Thank you, Trevor. Let's move on to the next one, which is the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act. And this was to prevent firearms and licensed dealers from being held liable in negligence when crimes have been committed with their products. Well, this is a curious one, but I mean, for those people who've been injured in firearms, particularly if there's something wrong with a firearm, I saw a show not too long ago that talked about a particular firearms manufacturer that the gun would just go off spontaneously, and it was a long rifle. And so essentially the design was bad. And in fact, a young man had been imprisoned a long time in the state of Mississippi. His claim was that the firearm went off spontaneously when he unfortunately pointed it at his brother. And as a result of that, he's in prison, been in there a long time. He's trying to prove there's a problem with the design. And of course, I think the 60 Minutes did a show on it also. But you know, the idea now is that you really can't hold firearms manufacturers liable for certain things that they produce, just the fact that they produced them.
I think this is intended to sort of like a dram shop act, similar that protects bar owners. And the law presumes that if a drunk person leaves the bar and has an accident, that it wasn't the negligence of the bar owner, it was the negligence of the person driving that caused the accident. But let me tell you something real quick before we run out of time. I did an internship in the Firearm Tool Mart section of the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation. And the most common excuse when a shooting occurred was, quote unquote, the gun just went off. And those examiners, when that was the excuse, would put a dummy round in with a live primer and would do anything they could to manipulate the weapon to try to get it to discharge without pulling the trigger. And all the examiners I talked to could not recall a single instance where the firing pin struck the primer unless somebody pulled the trigger.
That's a good anecdotal way for us to end this exhilarating show we've put on about firearms and gun control, about our constitutional rights to bear arms. We've talked about the idea that You frequently hear that there's no gun control in this country, or it's very limited, or it needs to be improved. Simply not true. I think we've demonstrated there's quite a bit of gun control. Might need to be some tweaking done to it. But this has been our show. Clay Whitaker here, Trevor Atchley for Legal Bytes on Nooga Radio. Call us anytime about any topic. We're pleased to talk to you, or at our law office, McCoon, Williams, Atchley, and Stanley, 756-6400. See you next time.
The Tennessee Valley's news talk leader, Nooga Radio, digital FM 95.3 HD4 and 92.7 FM.
If you've suffered a personal injury or a loved one was the victim of a wrongful death, give the lawyers at McCoon, Williams, Atchley, and Stanley a call. Our attorneys can help you or your business with a wide array of challenges to provide you with the highest quality legal services through the combination of our talents, experience, and expertise. If you're hit by business problems or need legal organization, we're here to help. Visit MWALawFirm.com. That's MWALawFirm.com. Give us a call at 423-756-6400. That's 756-6400.
Goss Insurance. Yes, we are local. And no, we don't have an 800 number. In fact, our mobile numbers are on our business cards. We live, work, play, and worship in Chattanooga, and we would love to help with your insurance. Business, auto, home, life insurance. Call now, save money. Call Goss Insurance for all your insurance needs. Goss Insurance, 875-2500. 875-2500.
Hey, Mom.
Yes, Summer.
I know what I'd like to do for Christmas this year.
What would you like to do?
Take shoeboxes full of goodies to the homeless military veterans.
What would go into these shoeboxes?
Toothbrushes, toothpaste, dental floss, deodorant, chapsticks, shampoo, soap, hand warmers, hand sanitizer, socks, gloves, toboggans, small Bibles, blankets, snacks, and cough drops.
Where can people donate these items?
Alpine Crest Elementary School, Sonic on Hickson Pike next to Frontrunner, Chick-fil-A in Northgate Mall in Hickson, and Nooga Radio below Goss Insurance across from Bojangles on Hickson Pike.
When will we distribute the shoeboxes?
On November 10th from 11 to 12:30.
WBLZ HD4 Ottawa, W224AZ Chattanooga.
92.7 digital FM 95.3 HD4 Chattanooga.
CBS News. I'm Steve Kafin. Fats Domino, one of the early kings of rock and roll, has died. Rolling Stone magazine's Anthony DeCurtis.
He defined a sound, this kind of rollicking barrel house piano sound that, was very distinctive.
Fats Domino was a symbol of New Orleans. He was rescued during Hurricane Katrina. WWL